In December 1941, over Oahu carrier-based A6M Zeros from Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet showed the United States what a long-legged, highly trained Japanese naval fighter force could do. The Zero, especially in its early A6M2 form, had far greater range than American carrier fighters when fitted with a drop tank, which allowed Japan to launch from distant carriers, and still its light construction, excellent lift, and responsive controls let it outturn and outclimb the F4F Wildcat that U.S. carrier squadrons were flying. This was not just a Pearl Harbor surprise. Early 1900 for the U.S. Navy operating carriers like Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, and later Hornet, that was a hard problem. The Wildcat was tough and well-armed, but it was heavier, it did not turn as tightly, and it did not climb as fast. Japanese naval aviation taught aggressive maneuver-first tactics in three-plane shot-eye elements, rewarding the pilot who could close out maneuver and kill at short range. Many American and Allied pilots went up against this style of fighting. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach, a thoughtful fighter officer, decided that the answer was not to wait years for a better airplane. He studied the reports on the Zero in 1941 and reframed the problem: if one Wildcat could not outfly a Zero, maybe two Wildcats flying as a single weapon could. He devised what would be called the Thach Weave. Two fighters flew roughly parallel courses. If a Zero latched onto one of them, both Wildcats turned toward each other, crossing. That inward turn forced the pursuer to fly across the guns of the other Wildcat. It was a tactic built on geometry, timing, and trust between pilots. It fit the Navy's division structure and could be taught quickly. The key idea was simple: teamwork beats agility. Japanese pilots did not have an immediate counter to that kind of coordinated defensive-offensive turn. Their doctrine emphasized the individual pilot's initiative in a maneuvering fight, not two aircraft mutual support designed to trap a pursuer. For a few months, the weave remained a concept. Then came Midway in June 1942. Thach, flying from Yorktown, finally got to use the maneuver against real A6M. The Zero pilots, expecting a familiar one-on-one kill, suddenly found themselves crossing the sights of another Wildcat. It worked. That combat proved the point Thach had argued on paper. American pilots did not need to match the Zero's turn rate if they fought in pairs and forced the enemy into a crossing pattern. Set against your title, this is the arc. Japanese naval aviators in 1941, early 1942, were trained. In late 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Pacific War with a fighter arm that had been shaped for years around the idea that a superb airplane flown by a highly trained pilot could win a fight in the horizontal plane. Pre-war IJN training was long, selective, and expensive. Pilots learned to handle light, high-lift fighters in tight turns to close to short range and to finish quickly. The A6M Zero, especially in its early war form, was made for that philosophy: light, with generous wing area, excellent low-speed handling, and a range that let it escort strikes far from the carrier. Allied pilots who fought it. On the American side, the situation was harsher. U.S. Navy carrier groups in 1941, early 1942, were operating the Grumman F4F Wildcat, a tough, well-armed fighter, but one that was heavier and could not match the Zero in climb or sustained turn. Reports coming back from early encounters and from other Allied theaters where the Zero appeared said the same thing. Do not try to. He was not in a position to demand a new fighter, and even if he had been, the Navy could not get one in time to matter in 1942. So he did the thing that good naval officers do when hardware is fixed: he changed the way the hardware was used. Thach's insight was to flip the terms of the fight. If the Japanese fighter school was built around a single pilot, dominating a single adversary in close maneuver, then the U.S. should stop offering single adversaries. The U.S. Navy already organized fighters in four-plane divisions. If a Zero picked one of them to chase, doing exactly what Japanese doctrine encouraged it to do, both Wildcats would turn toward each other. Their flight paths would cross. The Zero fixed on the target in front of it would have to fly through the gun sight of the other Wildcat. This was the essence of the Thach Weave turned Japanese dual training into a trigger for an American ambush. It was defensive in its opening move. My wingman is being chased, so we both turn, but offensive in its effect because it forced the pursuer into a predictable line of fire, and it was teachable. Pilots could practice it in the circuit in mock attacks in the limited flying time they had. Even if many carrier pilots in 1942 had far fewer hours than pre-war. Japanese aviators, they could still learn to count seconds, judge closure, and pull inboard at the signal. That is why the tactic mattered. It was realistic. While American squadrons were drilling this, Japanese carrier fighter units were not anticipating it. IJN fighter doctrine used three plane elements and put weight on the initiative of the leader, on exploiting the Zero's superb turning performance, and on killing quickly before enemy reinforcements arrived. That style worked brilliantly against isolated or what it did not account for was two opponents that refused to separate and that actually wanted to be chased because a second set of guns was waiting. So you get the asymmetry your title talks about. One side was trained for duels. The other side, having learned it, could not win duels, now forced team fights. The proof moment came at Midway in June 1942. Yorktown's fighters, with Thach among them, finally met Zeros in the kind of action the maneuver had been built for. Wildcats that could not hope to outturn an A6M used the weave and made the Japanese pilots fly through their partner's fire. That is the point where your title's second half becomes true in history. The tactic moved from clever idea, born from intelligence reports, to combat-tested method that lets slower U.S. fighters survive and kill. After Midway, the U.S. Navy had something priceless, a demonstrated way to take a supposedly inferior fighter and by pairing it make it dangerous to the best dogfighters Japan had. From the human point of view, this mattered even more than the geometry. Early in the war, American pilots knew the stories. The Zero can outclimb you. It can outturn you. Do not try to fight its fight. That knowledge is draining. The Thach Weave gave them a positive rule instead of a negative one. The rule was, stay with your wingman and you can beat him. That restores confidence. It turns the fear of being bounced. Navy's organizational strength, disciplined formations, radio control, and a willingness to standardize tactics across the fleet. Seen from the Japanese side, the change would have been jarring. Pilots trained to win by personal skill, and the Zero's agility now found that the Americans, instead of obligingly turning with them, were crossing, covering, and shooting from angles that were not there in a clean duel. What had been a rhythm, close turn finish was broken. That is why your title works. Japanese pilots trained for one air arm had invested in the individual. The other discovered that two average fighters flown together could kill the individual. That is the historically safe, longer version that still tracks the title exactly. On 4 June 1940, their pilots, many with long pre-war training and combat experience from China, flew in three aircraft Shotai formations and entered battle expecting to win a turning fight. That was the style the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for close maneuver finish. But by Midway, the American fighters were no longer offering clean one-on-one duels. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach, leading Yorktown's fighters, brought into combat the maneuver he had developed months earlier to counter the Zero's superior agility. The Thach Weave was simple in concept and demanding in execution. Two Wildcats flew on roughly parallel courses, separated enough to see one another. If a Zero latched onto one of them, the threatened pilot signaled and both aircraft turned toward each other. The Japanese pursuer focused on its victim was pulled across the guns of the second Wildcat. It was not a test of which airplane turned tighter. It was a test of which side could keep formation and trust the plan. U.S. Radar direction and carrier fighter control gave American pilots precious minutes of warning to form up before the Japanese strike reached them. That meant Wildcats could be in position in pairs ready to weave instead of scrambling alone. From the Japanese cockpit, this was a break in the expected rhythm. The target that should have died pulled across the sky, and another F4F1 that had not been in the gun sight a second earlier opened fire. The dual-trained pilot had walked straight into a team ambush. Thach's division at Midway showed that the idea worked in real combat. Wildcats that could not outturn the A6M stayed alive and got shots in because they refused to be separated. The success was not total. American fighters still took losses in the fierce attacks, and the overall battle was decided chiefly by the U.S. dive bombers that struck Japanese carriers at a critical moment. But the Navy fighters could survive and hit back against the Zero if they fought as disciplined teams. For Japan, this was the deeper cost. Its carrier air groups in 1942 still relied on a cadre of highly trained, hard-to-replace pilots. Every engagement where American fighters forced Zeros into unfavorable gunnery angles increased Japanese attrition. The Thach Weave did not erase the Zero's strengths, but it forced Japanese. This brings the text in line with your title, Japanese pilots trained for duels. Then the Thach Weave turned teams into killers. One side came in built for the individual, the other side invented a formation move that, by the second half of 1942, the air war over the South Pacific was no longer the clean, one-sided display that Japanese carrier pilots had enjoyed in 1941. At Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, and in early sweeps over Allied airfields, Zero pilots could rely on the style they had been trained in for years: enter with altitude, pick a target, turn inside it, finish quickly, and climb. First, the Zero had to keep its edge in turn and climb over the enemy fighter. Second, the enemy pilot had to accept the duel on those terms. Once American pilots decided to stop granting that second condition, Japanese advantage. The U.S. Navy's discovery at Midway, in June 1942, was therefore bigger than one successful division, using an experimental maneuver. What Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach proved was that the problem was not the Zero is unbeatable. The problem was a single. That insight traveled fast because it solved a frontline problem with frontline means. It did not ask for a factory change. It did not require a new engine. It only required pilots to fly in pairs and do what the section leader said. American carriers in the South Pacific and the mixed Navy-Marine aviation effort around Guadalcanal were exactly the kind of forces that needed a tactic like that. They were operating at long range, under pressure, with pilots rotating in and out, and with no guarantee that every man on the line had the same amount of flight time. A maneuver that was geometric, that used the Navy's existing four-plane division, and that could be shown in one or two practice hops, was perfect for that. So squadrons began to fold it into their normal combat air patrol behavior. Two fighters on stage. This was the exact opposite of what many Japanese pilots expected. Imperial Japanese Navy fighter doctrine still centered on small maneuverable elements, on the leader's judgment, and on the belief that a highly trained pilot in a superior turning fighter could impose the terms of the fight. That belief had been validated in 1941, early 1942, so there was no pressing reason on the Japanese side. As a result, through late 1942, the same pattern kept repeating. A Zero committed to a chase closed on an American fighter and then found that the American had a partner turning across its nose. Even when the carrier battle off the Santa Cruz Islands came on 26 October 1942, American fighters were not magically superior to the Zero. They were still outturned in a pure dogfight, but they were harder to kill. Cooperative section tactics, including the Thach-style weave, made it more costly for Japanese fighters to press a tail chase on U.S. aircraft that were covering the American strike groups. That mattered because by this point, Japan was already dipping into the pool of its best carrier aviators. Losses at Coral Sea and Midway had taken away men who had been in uniform and in training since before the war. Every time a Zero got pulled across the guns of a covering F4F in late 1942, Japan was trading away experience it could not regenerate quickly. For the American pilots, the change was psychological and practical at the same time. In early 1942, the legend of the Zero was that if it got on your tail, you were finished. The Weave cut straight through that myth. A Wildcat pilot who felt a Zero sliding in behind him did not have to try some desperate low. Two average pilots, flying average American fighters, could now do to a Zero what only the very best single pilot might have managed before. That is exactly what your title is describing: teamwork turning ordinary fighters into killers against opponents who still thought in terms of duels. This also meshed perfectly with the way the U.S. Navy was modernizing its fighter control. Ships were getting better at using radar to spot incoming raids, to tell fighters when and where to climb, and to vector them in groups rather than singly. A tactic like the Thach Weave was more effective the earlier the fighters were organized. Radar warning gave them those extra minutes to form into pairs and to meet the Japanese in the right geometry. So, what started as one officer's solution to an agility gap in 1941 became, by late 1942, part of a larger American pattern. On the Japanese side, the tactical irritation slowly turned into a structural problem. The pre-war pilot syllabus had been long, selective, and expensive. Those pilots were superb in the kind of fluid turning air combat the Zero excelled at. But a tactic like the Weave forced them to stay in the fight longer, to maneuver harder, and to make that meant more fuel burned, more exposure to defensive fire, and eventually more losses among men who could not be replaced at the same standard. By early 1943, when the U.S. began to field the F6F if we zoom out from Midway through Guadalcanal into early 1943, the through line stays intact. Japanese pilots had been trained for the duel, and their airplane rewarded it. Americans identified that as the center of gravity and built a tactic that made the duel a bad choice. The tactic was simple enough and matched U.S. organization well enough to spread across ships and even to shore-based Marine Navy units. Once it spread, every Zero pilot who tried to fly the old way risked flying straight into American guns. That is why your title works not just for Midway, but for the whole late 1942 phase, the Thach Weave was the moment when the U.S. side said, "We will not try to be better duelists. We will make you suffer for trying to duel." And from that point on, American fighter tactics were about making the team, not the single pilot, the real weapon. By mid-1943 inches, the Solomons and across the Central Pacific American fighter units were no longer experimenting with the Thach Weave. They were living in it. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons that had fought over Guadalcanal, flown from Enterprise, or operated out of Henderson Field, Thach had proved at Midway. Two fighters fighting as one had now been written into the way Americans flew. Sections took off, already thinking in pairs, and CAP procedures assumed a wingman close enough to cross in front if a Zero committed to the chase. Japan's carriers and land-based units could still send the Zero far out over the ocean thanks to its excellent range with drop tanks, but the quality of the pilots inside those cockpits was not what it had been in 1941, early 1942. Losses at Coral Sea Midway, the Solomons, and constant small-scale attrition had eaten into the pre-war trained corps. At the same time, the Americans were doing the opposite. More carriers, more radar sets, more fighter direction, and a doctrine that said, no U.S. pilot fights alone. That is exactly the environment where a formation tactic like the Weave becomes more dangerous. The team is always there to execute it. The power of the Weave in 1943 was not that it was complicated, but that it fitted perfectly into the Navy's four-plane division. Where Japanese Shotai put weight on the leader's individual skill and the Zero's agility, American divisions put weight on mutual support. So, when a Japanese pilot in 1943 dived on what looked like a single Wildcat or a new F6F Hellcat, he was often diving on only half the problem. The American would start to turn inboard, the wingman would answer, and suddenly the attacker was crossing a set of 50 caliber guns. Even if the American did not get a clean kill, the Japanese pilot had been denied the quick, elegant duel his training was built for. Every denied duel was a small American victory. Operational reality still bit both sides. Engines had to be kept serviceable, squadrons had to rotate, long patrols wore pilots down. But here, American logistics and standardization made the difference. Because the tactic was simple, because it had been written down and circulated, and because radar-based fighter control could give fighters time to form up, the U.S. could teach and reteach the Weave to new pilots entering the theater. Japan, already short of highly trained instructors and trying to replace combat losses with men who had fewer hours, could not roll out an equally universal anti-Weave doctrine. When the war moved forward and the U.S. Navy began its great carrier offensives of 1944, the same philosophy was still visible. By then, most frontline fighters were F6F Hellcats, a machine that outclassed the early war Zero in durability dive and often in climb. But the Hellcat was stepping into a culture that had already accepted that two disciplined fighters could kill a more agile opponent. In the great carrier battles of 1944, fought under superb American radar control and against Japanese air groups no longer filled with pre-war aces, those cooperative section-based tactics helped turn Japanese attacks into broken, attrited formations. It was not the Weave alone that produced the U.S. dominance of 1944, but the Weave had done something crucial a year earlier. It had taught the American side to stop thinking like duelists. From the Japanese side, this was the heart of the frustration. Pilots who had been trained to win by individual maneuver kept finding that the Americans would not hold still for a fair fight. Targets crossed, wingmen appeared, and every attempt to finish a single enemy exposed the Zero to fire from another direction. As replacements with fewer flight hours filled out Japanese squadrons in 1943-44, that problem got worse. Less experienced pilots were being asked to win a duel against an enemy who no longer offered duels. That is exactly what your title says. The Imperial Japanese Navy went to war with pilots trained for duels. The U.S. Navy answered with a tactic that made duels a trap. And once that tactic was standardized, 1,942 inches, the Solomons solid by 1943, It turned ordinary American sections into killers against a weakening Japanese air arm. By late 1944, from the fast carrier forces covering Leyte operations to the drives that pointed toward Iwo Jima U.S. Navy and Marine Corps air groups were fighting in a way that would have looked entirely unfamiliar to the dual-minded Japanese pilots of 1941. The maneuver, John S. Thach had built in 1941-42 to keep two slow Wildcats alive against a superior turning zero, was no longer just a clever trick. Its logic, two fighters covering each other, refusing to be isolated, had been absorbed into U.S. fighter doctrine. Now the fighters were F6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs, faster, tougher, and better climbing than the early war F4F, but they were still flown in the same disciplined mutual support divisions that the Weave had been designed for. American advantages in 1944 stacked on top of that tactical foundation. Radar-directed fighter control was by then routine on U.S. carriers, so fighters were being launched and formed, with warning not thrown up piecemeal. That meant sections could be in position as pairs when Japanese raids came in. When Japanese pilots, many of them wartime trained, with far fewer hours than the 1,941 elite, tried to close for the familiar tail chase, they met U.S. fighters that crossed, turned toward each other, and put them in someone else's guns. The core idea from 1942 had survived. Do not give the Japanese the clean one-on-one they were taught for. On the Japanese side, the contrast with 1941 was stark. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost much of its pre-war, long-trained fighter cadre in 1942-43. The replacements who filled air groups in 1944 did not have the same time in the cockpit, nor the same depth of tactical schooling. Yet the underlying doctrine, small elements leader initiative confidence in the Zero's agility, had not been fundamentally reworked to defeat American two-aircraft traps. So in 1944, when Japanese fighters met U.S. carrier caps over the Philippines area, they were flying 1941 style ideas against a 1944 American system built on radar numbers and mutual support. That mismatch was brutal. From the American cockpit, the psychology had flipped completely since early 1942. Pilots no longer whispered about the Zero as an untouchable dogfighter. They had a bigger, better airplane, they had early warning, and they had a way to turn a Japanese pursuit into a shot for the wingman, something they had been practicing in one form or another since Midway. A chased fighter did not have to outturn the attacker. He only had to stay inside the team's geometry. That is the exact promise your title points to Japanese pilots trained for duels. Americans built a system where the duel became a trap. Leyte Gulf in October 1944 showed this gap clearly. U.S. carriers could put large, well-controlled fighter sweeps into the air. Japanese air groups short on veteran pilots and flying into American radar coverage could not force prolonged favorable engagements. American fighters broke up Japanese strikes, shot down significant numbers of attackers and protected the fleet. And they did it as organized divisions, not as lone aces. The principles that had started with the Thach Weave, stay in pairs, force the attacker to cross your wingman's guns, do not let yourself be isolated, were now so normal that new aircraft and new pilots simply inherited them. By 1945, as the fighting moved closer to Japan, and kamikaze attacks replaced the carrier versus carrier battles of 1942, that same culture of mutual support still mattered. The U.S. Navy had proved something that went beyond one maneuver. Tactical innovation, plus organizational discipline, can erase a foe's early-edge airplane and a foe's duel-based training. The Japanese had entered the war with pilots who could win a fair dogfight. The Americans ended the war with pilots who refused to give them one, and because of that, those American teams became the killers. In 1942, the U.S. Navy proved something very simple. In the Pacific, Japanese naval aviators had been trained for the duel, and if you denied them that duel with a two-aircraft trap, the Thach Weave, you could keep slower American fighters alive, and even kill the Zero. That was the seed. What survived after 1945 was not the exact WW2 geometry of two F4Fs flying parallel and turning inward. What survived was the rule behind it. Two fighters that see each other and plan together are harder to kill than one brilliant pilot fighting alone. That rule carried forward into the jet era. In Korea, 1009, 151,953, Navy and Marine pilots suddenly faced swept-wing MiG-15 seconds rather than zeros. The speeds were far higher, and the vertical fight mattered more, so nobody was literally flying the 1942 Thach Weave. But they were still flying in two-ship elements, still watching each other's six, still ready to turn an enemy's fixation on one jet into a shot for the other. That is the same logic Thach used adapted to jets: let him chase, then make him cross your wingman's nose. It worked because U.S. naval aviation came out of WW2 already convinced that mutual support beats individual aerobatics, something it had learned at the expense of Japanese duel tactics. By the 1960 seconds, when the Navy went to war over Vietnam with the F-4 Phantom, another problem appeared: missiles cluttered, radar pictures, and MiG-17s, MiG-21 seconds that could turn tighter than the Phantom. Out of that came tactics like the loose deuce, two fighters, one engaging, one supporting roles, interchangeable. If you read it back through the WW2 lens, loose deuce is the jet age way of saying what Thach said in 1942: do not let the enemy fight just one of you. The Navy's fighter weapons school Top Gun formalized that, in 1969, mutual support is not optional, it is your survival plan. Instructors could point all the way back to the Pacific when Americans stopped trying to outturn the Zero and started fighting in teams. The loss rate dropped. From the enemy cockpit, first Japanese in 1942, later Soviet-trained pilots in Vietnam, the frustration looks similar. You roll in, thinking you have isolated one American, and another American appears in a position to shoot. In 1942, that happened at F4F speeds. In 1967, it happened at phantom speeds, but the psychological effect is the same. The Americans refused to give you the clean, heroic, one-on-one fight your syllabus assumed. That is exactly the story your title tells. As aircraft improved, F-8, Crusader F-4, Phantom later, F-14, Tomcat and F-A-18, the Navy did not throw that lesson away. Instead, it scaled it. Better radar and controllers gave more warning. Data links later let fighters share what they saw, but the geometry stayed familiar. Two fighters working together to force a bandit into a predictable line, then killing him from the supporting team. Position. Big exercises like red flag or fleet air defense drills in the 1970 seconds, 1990 seconds simply ran that same logic at higher speed and with more airplanes.